Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most horrific crimes to ever have taken place in the UK. Fred and Rose West. Their story begins between 1967 and 1987. Britain was victim to two of the most nefarious killers the country has ever seen. Married couple Fred and Rose West, who in the course of 20 years are rumoured to have killed upwards of 13 women. Among the victims were Mr. West's ex-wife and daughter, as well as numerous teen girls who were misled by the couple. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on the 29th of September 1941, the first of 6 surviving children to the West family, in Much Marcle, Herefordshire. Born to a family of poor farm workers in a small community, Mr. West's family were said to be a close-knit and protected bunch and would always look after one another. In particular, he was close with his mother, who took a preference for him over his 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Spending his youth at Moorcote Cottage on Moorcote Farm, where his father worked as a labourer, the 6 children were expected to help their parents with farm work. The boys had hunting and harvesting, while the girls foraged fruit and hops. The entirety of the Mr. West family had a strong, self-dependent work ethic as a result. This can take the form of either a burglary or a robbery, the difference in English and Welsh law being that a robbery uses force, which means that some of the heists commonly known as robberies were actually burglaries. The Brinksmat robbery occurred at the heat. Mr. West was not a bright student, being more skilled at manual labour, to such a point that at the age of 15 he dropped out of school and pursued farm labouring, instead of on the same farm as his father. At this time he also frequented the Ledbury Youth Club, in which he soon got a reputation for aggressively objectifying and harassing young girls, sexually assaulting them on numerous occasions. He reportedly sexually assaulted a girl who rejected his advances at a dance, and he once apparently deliberately rode his motorcycle at another young woman in the village. Girls that accepted these advances described Mr. West's performance as unsatisfying, working only to his own gratification. It is often argued that certain serial killers are unable to perform well sexually, which can push them towards committing their crimes, as they develop a hatred for women due to their insecurities. Among other factors, however, in this case, use the argument that can be made that Mr. West's affinity with young girls and his depreciation of the female gender in general, even as a child, as we see here, made his actions not an action of sexual insecurity, but one for his own pleasure, demonstrating the unhinged nature of the man's mind. While it was undeniable that Mr. West had shown his true nature in his youth, it arguably escalated following a motorcycle accident shortly after his 17th birthday, which left him comatose for a week with serious head injuries. A metal plate was placed in his head that may have affected his behaviour and impulse control, according to some experts, offering a possible explanation for the escalation in Mr. West's deviant behaviour. 2 years later, Fred suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape outside the youth club punched him, sending him falling 2 floors. In June of 1961, Fred was accused of raping and impregnating a 13-year-old family friend. Arrested the same month, Fred freely admitted to the police he had been molesting young girls since his early teens, and he asked them, "Doesn't everybody do it?" He escaped a jail sentence as it was claimed that he was suffering fits as a result of his head trauma, but he was convicted of child molestation. At the age of 21, Fred West reconnected with a childhood girlfriend, Glaswegian Catherine Rena Bernadette Costello, who at the time was pregnant with another man's child. The two married in Ledbury on the 17th of November, unbeknownst to the West family, the sole guest being Fred's younger brother John. The couple initially lived in Fred's aunt's home, and then moved to Coatbridge, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter Charmaine was born in March on 1963, and Mr. West willingly accepted her as his own. Shortly thereafter, the couple relocated to Savoy Street in the Bridgetown district of Glasgow. In July of 1964, Rena bore Fred a daughter, Anne-Marie. It is said that Mr. West was extremely strict on his children and often grew violent against his family, even Charmaine, who was still a toddler at the time. He is also reported to have begun sexually abusing Charmaine and to have encouraged Rena to turn to prostitution to supplement his measly income. He also cheated regularly on his wife, one of his mistresses being 16-year-old Anne McFall, whom Fred had promised to marry. Following the family's moving to Gloucester and the deterioration of his marriage, following which Rena returned to Scotland, McFall became a nanny to the two children whilst Mr. West worked. In July of 1967, McFall, aged 19 and 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, vanished. Her dismembered remains were found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarcle, Mr. West's hometown, and Kempley in June 1994. Though never officially confirmed, it is thought that Fred claimed responsibility for the young girl's death. For a time, Rena, Mr. West's wife, returned to help with the children, but only a year later she left the children alone with him again. It was reported that in these times, when Mr. West had no women around, he gave the two girls to social services to look after, getting them back only after he met Rose. Rosemary Pauline West, maiden name Letts, was born on the 29th of November, 1953, the fifth of the seven to a large and very poor family. Her father was in the Navy, though he had to leave to take care of her mother, who suffered extreme postnatal depression. Rose's childhood was anything but peaceful with her parents. The Letts were described as a dysfunctional family that didn't fit into the community, and the children were never allowed to play outside. And this did not come without reason. In fear of violence from Bill, Daisy developed an obsession with keeping the house clean, to such an extent that the children weren't allowed out in case they got dirty. The mother of the 7 children was treated for her extreme depression using electroconvulsive therapy during her pregnancy with Rose. Her last round of treatment was in fact administered the day before the birth of Rosemary, which criminal psychologist Dr. David Holmes suggests would have impacted her brain development, as the latest point of pregnancy is often the most critical in developing empathy and a conscience. Daisy's excessive and severe mental health problems likely played a part in Miss West's own mental illness, and the stressors she underwent in the womb, both through the therapy and through the mental torment of her mother at the time, has been suggested as a key cause for the deranged mental state Rose carried into adulthood. Bill Letts, a drunk with no acclimation to civilian life, made Rose's childhood anything but peaceful. The family lived in intense fear of their patriarch and former neighbour Gil Job, who grew up next to Letts' family, and stated she could hear awful screams, shouts and banging during their time in close proximity. Bill Letts lost his status and self-worth, having to return to family life, and he grew to resent his children. He tried to regain his power at home by being regimented with the kids. Geoffrey Wansell, official biographer of Frederick Mr. West, says Letts was a tyrant of a father who made his children clean the carpet with toothbrushes. Bill's violent and unpredictable nature can largely be attributed to his mental illness. He was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic as a teenager, but never disclosed this to his family and didn't get treatment, likely heightening his issues tenfold through stress and massive change from his structured lifestyle in the Navy. Amid an atmosphere of fear, Rose became reclusive and disengaged, and Letts exploited this massively to abuse her vulnerable nature. Throughout her childhood, he sexually abused his daughter, paving the pathway for abusive and unhealthy relationships and coping mechanisms in the future. In adulthood, with Fred's blessing, the incestuous relationship continued, and Rose, unable to face her childhood, often described it in a positive manner and portrayed her parents as protective and loving, demonstrating the effect said abuse had on her mental state. The couple first met shortly following Rose's 15th birthday in 1969, at which point in time Fred was 27 years old. By this point, Mr. West had already been married once, fathered 2 children, and had killed his 8-month pregnant girlfriend with whom he had been having an affair. Meeting at Cheltenham bus station, she was revolted by the man, but Rose became infatuated with the attention the man gave her, and though she declined a date with him twice, she allowed him to walk her home on occasion. Quickly, Fred discovered her reputation and convinced the girl to quit her job at a local bread shop and be a full-time nanny for him, promising to pay her so she could convince her parents she was still working. Several months later, Rose introduced Fred to her family, who were aghast at their daughter's choice of partner. Daisy Letts was unimpressed with Fred's boastful and arrogant behaviour, suggesting him to be a pathological liar. Her father vehemently disapproved of the relationship, threatening Fred directly and promising to call social services if he continued to associate with his daughter. He followed through with this threat, and Rose was placed in a home, with time on the weekends to visit her family, which she inevitably used to meet with Fred. At the age of 16, only a year after meeting Fred, she moved in with him and a few months later they moved from the caravan to a 2-storey house in Midland Road, Gloucester. On the 17th of October 1970, Rosemary gave birth to their daughter, though there was speculation the child was in fact her father's, Heather Ann. Fred, Mr. West, was imprisoned for theft on the 4th of December 1970 and remained so until his release on the 24th of June 1971, during which time Rose was alone and taking care of the children, all of whom were expected to refer to Rose as their mother. Mr. West's second daughter, Anne-Marie, explained that in their time alone with Rose, they were both physically and emotionally abused by their stepmother, and seemed to find gratification in their displays of pain and upset. Charmaine, however, refused to do so, which would send Rose into a rage. Anne-Marie suggested that Charmaine held desperately onto the belief that her mummy will come and save me. Anne-Marie later recollected her sister repeatedly antagonized Rose by making statements such as, "My real mummy wouldn't swear or shout at us," in response to Rose's scathing language. A childhood friend of Charmaine's named Tracy Giles, who had lived in the upper flat of Midland Road, would later recollect an incident in which she had entered Mr. West's flat unannounced only to see Charmaine naked, standing upon a chair and gagged with her hands bound behind her back with a belt, as Rose stood alongside the child with a large wooden spoon in her hand, truly demonstrating the extent of the sadistic abuse the young girls were victim to. Charmaine is likely to have been Rose West's first victim. It is believed that Rosemary killed Charmaine, Fred's stepdaughter from his first marriage, shortly before Mr. West's release in June of 1971. Charmaine disappeared in mid-June, with Rosemary explaining to Tracy Giles and her mother that she's gone to live with her mother, and bloody good riddance. Rena, Charmaine's mother, turned up in late August to collect Charmaine, and also disappeared. Following his release, Fred later buried her naked body in the yard close to the back door of the flat, and he remained adamant that he had not dismembered her, though evidence suggested an attempt had been made. Several bones, particularly finger, wrist, toe and ankle bones, were missing from Charmaine's skeleton, leading to the speculation the missing parts had been retained as keepsakes. Shortly after, the girl's mother also went missing. She's known to have visited Moorcock Cottage, Fred's childhood home, to inquire after the girls. Being provided with Fred's Midland Road address, Rena sought to confront him, likely to discuss or demand custody of her daughters. This was the final time Rena was seen alive, worrying after her children. She is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the back seat of Fred's Ford Popular and likely while intoxicated. When her body was discovered, a short length of metal tubing was found in her remains, suggesting the possibility she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. Rena's body was extensively dismembered, placed into plastic bags and buried close to a cluster of trees known as Yew Tree Coppice, a letterbox field about 1 mile from Muchmarcle. On the 29th of January 1972, Fred and Rosemary West married in Gloucester. On the 1st of June that year, Rosemary gave birth to their second daughter, May. Around this time, Mr. West encouraged his wife into prostitution. Fred encouraged Rose to seek clients in Gloucester's West Indian community. In addition to her prostitution, Rose engaged in casual sex with both female and male lodgers within her household, and also with individuals Fred encountered via his work, with Fred himself also joining in on occasion with 2 women. To many of the women, it became apparent that Rose and her husband took particular pleasure from seeking to take women beyond their sexual limits, typically via sessions involving bondage, as the Wests openly admitted to taking a particular pleasure from any form of sex involving a strong measure of dominance, pain and violence. Rosemary eventually had 7 children, 3 of whom were mixed race. Fred willingly accepted these children as his own and falsely informed them the reason for their skin colour being darker than that of their siblings was because his great-grandmother was a black woman. Needing a bigger house, the family moved to 25 Cromwell Street, where Mr. West converted the upper floor to bedsits to make money. Rose's room, the room Rosemary used for prostitution, had peepholes so he could watch. He often carried a baby monitor so that he could watch from anywhere in the house, and a red light outside the door for warning the children when not to enter because she was busy. Like Mr. West, Rosemary came from a family where incest was common, and her father would often take advantage of her promiscuity to engage in sexual relations with his daughter. This would happen with Mr. West's permission. The West's children were often victims of physical abuse, primarily from Rose. From the age of 7 they were given extensive chores, and in the event they were not completed, physical violence was used as a punishment. On one occasion, as their son Stephen was mopping the kitchen floor with a cloth, Rose accidentally stepped into the bowl of water he had been using. In response, Rose hit the boy over the head with the bowl and then repeatedly kicking him in the head and the chest as she shouted, "You did that on purpose, you little swine." On another occasion, Rose became furious about a missing kitchen utensil, then grabbed the knife she had been using to cut a slab of meat, repeatedly inflicting light scour marks to daughter May's chest until her ribcage was covered with light knife wounds. Anna Marie, the second oldest after Charmaine, often bore the brunt of both parents' sexual abuse and was forced into prostitution at the age of 13, with Rose telling clients she was 16. With all these clients, Rose remained in the room to ensure the young girl never revealed her true age. Aside from the prostitution, both parents frequently assaulted the girl, starting at the age of 8 until she ran away in 1979. After her escape, younger siblings May and Heather took her place, particularly after puberty. The two of them and son Stephen took an oath to protect each other and never allow either girl to be alone with their father. In October of 1972, the Wests hired 17-year-old Carolyn Roberts as the children's nanny, but she rejected Fred and Rosemary's advances into their sex circle and left a few weeks later. On the 6th of December 1972, the Wests invited her to their home, where they both raped her. Fred allowed Roberts to leave the next day, only after she promised she would return as their nanny. Miss Roberts reported the rape to police, but withdrew the accusation when the case came to court. The Wests pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of indecent assault and were fined only £50. While it is now thought the Wests committed at least one murder before the fact, it was after the assault charge that the Wests officially began their murder spree and terrorising of young women. Between the years of 1973 and 1979, the couple killed a further 8 people, as well as their daughter Heather in 1982. The first of their victims in this time was 19-year-old Linda Goff. The young girl had become acquainted with Fred and Rose West through a male lodger in the early 1973. Miss Goff regularly visited and engaged in affairs with 2 male lodgers at Cromwell House, and on the 19th of April, she moved into their home on Cromwell Street. Only a day or so later, on or about 20th of April, other tenants were told that she had been told to leave the household after she had hit one of their children. Following her disappearance, Miss Goff's mother called to visit, and Rosemary was wearing Miss Goff's clothes, and she told her that she had moved in order to work in Weston-super-Mare. When her dismembered body was found, the jewel was completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape to silence her in their torture, and 2 small tubes had likely been inserted into her nasal cavities to allow breathing. Miss Goff had likely been suspended from holes carved into the wooden beams supporting the ceiling of the cellar, which Fred later admitted that he had devised for the purpose of suspending his victims' bodies. The girl likely died of either strangulation or suffocation. Her dismembered body, missing several bones, was buried in an inspection pit beneath the garage. Next in the list of murders was 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, who was abducted on the 10th of November 1973. Cooper was abducted after spending the evening at a cinema with her boyfriend. She lived in the Pines Children's Home in Worcester. She had been waiting for a bus in Warndon when she just vanished, and was likely dragged into Fred's car, where her face was bound with surgical tape and her arms bound with braiding cloth, before she was driven to Cromwell Street. At Mr. West's address, in a similar manner to the aforementioned Goff, Cooper was suspended from the wooden beams of the cellar ceiling before her abuse and murder, and likely died from strangulation and asphyxiation. 21-year-old Lucy Catherine Partington, who was in her final year of reading English literature at Exeter University, was killed December 1973. She had just spent Christmas with her family in Cheltenham and decided to visit a friend, disappearing after leaving to catch a bus home. There is strong evidence that she had been kept alive for at least several days. A week after she disappeared, Fred went to a hospital in the early hours of the 3rd of January 1974 to get a serious laceration stitched up, suggesting the girl was still alive several days after the kidnapping. Matching the cut was found with Partington's body, and police surmised that he sustained the injury while dismembering the body. Theresa Siegenthaler came next, a Swiss sociology student who was just 21 when she was murdered by the Wests. She was hitchhiking from London to Wales. Siegenthaler was told her family that she was going to try and reach Ireland on her trip. Her family reported her missing to Scotland Yard when they stopped hearing from her. Fred built a fake chimney breast over her remains to hide them. She was found to have been gagged by a scarf and tied in a bow. Shirley Hubbard was killed in November 1974. Only aged 15, the Wests took her from a bus stop after leaving a date. When her remains were found, her head was completely covered in tape and only a 3-inch rubber tube inserted to allow her to breathe. Her remains were reportedly found in an area of the cellar decorated with wallpaper bearing Marilyn Monroe's image, along with the names of some of the star's movies, one of which, in poor taste, was the 1956 film Bus Stop. The final body that Fred buried in the cellar before concreting it over was that of 18-year-old Juanita Marion Mott, killed in April 1975. A former lodger at 25 Cromwell Street, she was rumoured to have been staying with a friend outside of the house, but made the fatal error of attempting to hitchhike when the Wests took her. From Carol Ann Cooper onwards, each successive victim, plus the paraphernalia discovered in each shallow grave, suggests that each victim was likely subjected to greater abuse and torture than those previously murdered. The torture of the Wests was relentless and violent in its very nature. After Marion Mott's death, Fred made the sickening decision to concrete over the woman's resting grounds, turning the basement into a bedroom for his oldest children, before taking a 3-year break from killing for reasons unknown. That was until Fred, unknown as to whether it was or without Rosemary's permission, killed 18-year-old Shirley Ann Robinson in May of 1978. The two had unfortunately met at the Green Lantern, the cafe Mr. West opened up with his wife's father, before becoming a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street. She soon became a prostitute for the Wests, and ended up pregnant with Fred's child. Rose, herself pregnant at the time, initially boasted to neighbours that the child Robinson was carrying was her husband's. However, she soon developed a deep resentment for the young girl. The motive for her murder is likely to have been the removal of a threat to the stability of Mr. West's relationship, to which Robinson now posed a threat. Her body was extensively dismembered. However, a lack of restraint suggests a sexual motive for this murder was unlikely, suggesting the murder was purely to keep the peace in the Mr. West household. The unborn baby had been removed and had several bones missing. Shortly thereafter, Rose unsuccessfully, but rather sickeningly, submitted a claim for maternity benefit in Robinson's name with Gloucester Social Services. Fred had originally planned to sell their baby to a childless couple. As seen with Charmaine and Linda, Fred and Rose shifted suspicions by claiming Robinson had been relocated to live with her father in West Germany. The couple's final official murder before that of their own daughter was that of Alison Chambers, killed August of 1979. It was also the last sexually motivated killing the couple are known to have committed. Only 16 years old, Chambers had run away from home to become Mr. West's live-in nanny at Cromwell Street. It is thought that she assimilated with the family for several weeks before her death, with Rose having promised the teen a home on a farm which she claimed to own. Her body was also buried in the garden of Cromwell Street, like Robinson, close to the bathroom wall, and although Chambers was likely dismembered, her skeleton was not marked by striations as the earlier victims' bodies had been. In order not to raise suspicion, Rose posted a letter written by the girl before her untimely death to her mother to appear as though she had not disappeared to the family. The final known murder in the West's terrifying spree was that of their own teenage daughter, Heather. After Anne-Marie's escape in the late 70s, Heather bore the brunt of her parents' sexual violence. Her father, in particular though, was reportedly never overly fond of the girl that she was. Emotionally abused by the parents, often being called ugly and a bitch by Fred, who also reportedly promised to impregnate not only Heather, but sister May as well, and to make son Stephen have sex with his mother Rose before he turned 17. Heather often complained to friends about the abuse she and her siblings endured, and her external signs of psychological distress such as nail biting, fidgeting, and lack of sleep were noted by several of them. Staff at the Hucklecote Secondary School, which Heather and her siblings attended, are also known to have expressed concern as to why Heather, otherwise well behaved, refused to obey orders either to change her clothing or for showering after sport activities. On one occasion she was forced to take a shower, resulting in her peers and staff noting her arms, legs and torso were covered in welts and bruises in various stages of healing. Heather stated that these injuries have been obtained in fights with her siblings, but confided in one close friend that they had been inflicted by her parents, adding that her mother considered her a little bitch who deserved her beatings. By the mid-1980s, rumours of Rose's sex life had reached several of the children's classmates, and Heather made the possibly life-threatening decision to confide in her friends that many of these rumours were in fact true. The father of one of these classmates was a friend of Mr. West. As such, word soon reached Fred and Rose that Heather had divulged details of their home life, including details of her mother's promiscuity to her classmates. Fred was so concerned by these revelations that he began to escort Heather to and from school until her graduation in 1986. At this time, the teen applied for many jobs to get away from Cromwell Street. Having set her hopes of escaping on a job in Torquay, when she was declined from this position, she reportedly loudly cried herself to sleep for the night, and the next day, the others returned from school to find her gone. Both parents lied, suggesting she had ran away with a lesbian lover to Torquay, and said the police could not be contacted because Heather was involved with credit card fraud. Fred occasionally jokingly threatened the children that they would end up under the patio like Heather if they either misbehaved or divulged the mistreatment they endured to anyone outside the household. With Rose's approval, he later constructed a barbecue pit immediately opposite where Heather had been buried. He placed a pine table on her grave for the children of the family to sit upon whenever the Wests held family gatherings at the garden. On the 25th of June in 2006, and in a joint operation with local police, 4 British men were arrested at a shopping centre in Morocco's capital, Rabat, after a 3-month-long investigation. These inquiries culminated in a search warrant being issued to excavate the West's garden in February of 1994. Heather was the turning point and the undoing in Mr. West's lies. In May of 1992, Fred asked his 13-year-old daughter, Louise, to bring some bottles to a room on the first floor of their home. Rose was not home. Shortly thereafter, Louise was found by her siblings writhing in pain, sobbing that her father had raped her. At one stage, partially strangled her. When Rose returned home, Louise confided her mother, to which Rose replied, "Oh well, you were asking for it." Over the following weeks, Louise was raped 3 more times, with Rose personally witnessing one. Fred also filmed one of these rapes. Several weeks later, Louise was brave enough to confide in a close friend what her father had done. This friend told her own mother what had happened on August 4th. The friend's mother anonymously informed the police. On the 6th of August 1992, the police searched the West household, stating they were searching for stolen property. Although numerous objects of sexual paraphernalia, including 99 pornographic videos of both homemade and otherwise, were discovered, police did not find the video depicting the assault on Louise. The 13-year-old made a full statement describing her father's actions. The fact the sexual abuse had begun when she was 11, and that her mother had been casually indifferent to her plight. All of the children in the household were placed in foster care the following day. Medical examinations revealed evidence of physical and sexual abuse. Police began their full-scale investigation, eventually leading to Fred being charged with 3 counts of rape and 1 of buggery, with Rose named as an accomplice. She was also charged with child cruelty, inciting her husband to engage in sex with their daughter, and obstructing the police. The Wests were questioned as to the whereabouts of their eldest daughter, Heather, and were unable to get their story straight. Although Fred claimed Heather was alive and well and supporting herself via prostitution, while Rose initially claimed to have no knowledge of Heather's whereabouts or why she had left home. Her final story suggests that she had given her daughter £600 to encourage her to leave the household, so as to protect her from the other children and her homosexual tendencies, before further stating to have maintained sporadic telephone contact with her daughter over the years. The following day, Rose was granted bail on the condition she did not maintain contact with any of the family before her trial. As Fred awaited trial, he was held on remand in Birmingham. Anna Marie also contacted the police to offer a full statement detailing her experiences as a child. In a statement given to Detective Constable Hazel Savage, Anna Marie recounted the extensive physical, mental and sexual abuse she had endured as a child at the hands of her father and stepmother, agreeing to testify against both parents at the upcoming trial. Anna Marie was also added that she had for several years been unsuccessfully attempting to trace her mother Rena and half-sisters Charmaine and Heather, who were at this point still assumed missing as opposed to dead. Chris Davis, Anna Marie's husband, said that although Heather had not shared the details of her enduring any sexual abuse, he had been so concerned for her welfare he had offered to confront her parents, to which the girl had said, "For Christ's sake, don't, because they'll kill us both." Davis then suggested they might wish to speak to the missing daughter Heather for more details. 2 months later, Gloucester Social Services also contacted police to stress their concern over the whereabouts of Heather. This case against the West collapsed when Anna Marie and her 13-year-old half-sister Louise declined to testify at the court case on the 7th of June 1993, with the child rape victim expressing her desire to return to her family, and Anna Marie choosing to withdraw her statement because of her noting the misery of her younger siblings and her fear of Rose. However, it was not the end of the case, as DC Hazel Savage was still rightly suspicious of the couple. Police, while retracing Fred's history, discovered that although Rena and Charmaine had disappeared in 1971, no missing person report had ever been filed on either of them. Convinced Heather was dead and that Fred's repeated statement to his children that her body lay beneath the family patio might be true, Gloucester police successfully applied for a search warrant authorising the search of 25 Cromwell Street to locate Heather's remains. In the early hours of the following morning, Fred told his son Stephen to go to the papers and make as much money as he could, as he had done something bad, before handing himself in to the police for Heather's death. At 11:15 that morning, Fred admitted to the police he had indeed killed his daughter in an act of manslaughter. He confessed to strangling Heather in a fit of rage, then dismembering her body in the ground floor bathroom with a heavy serrated knife he normally used for cutting slabs of frozen meat. Her remains had been stored in a dustbin as he waited for an opportunity to dig her grave. Fred was insistent his wife had no knowledge of the daughter's murder. Adding the fact the search team had not yet unearthed Heather's remains was because they had been excavating the wrong section of his garden, likely a cover-up to hide the locations of the other bodies, but it did not work. Not long later, police found a human thigh bone in a section of the garden Fred had insisted police need not look in. Excavating the section of the garden where Fred had indicated he had buried his daughter's body, investigators discovered human remains encased in the remnants of a bin bag and tied with 2 lengths of rope. The body's fingernails were discovered in a pile, suggesting they may have been torn from her fingers as a means of torture. The body was identified via dental records as being that of Heather West. That evening, having been formally charged with his daughter's murder and questioned as to why police had also discovered a 3rd thigh bone, Fred confessed there were 2 further sets of human remains in his garden, one of whom he named as Shirley Robinson. Both sets of human remains were discovered on the 28th of February, and Fred was charged with both murders 2 days later. The decision was made to thoroughly search the entire property following the recent discoveries. Rose was placed into a safe house in a nearby town of Dursley, as police commenced their search inside 25 Cromwell Street. Informed of this fact, plus the pressure of 16-hour interrogations every day as to his, Rena and Charmaine's whereabouts, Fred authorised his solicitor to pass a note he had written to the leader of the murder investigation, Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Police. This note, dated the 4th of March, read, "I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approximately 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goth, and others to be identified. Signed, Mr. F. West." Questioned further, Fred told police there were a further 5 bodies on the property of 25 Cromwell Street. Most of these victims, he suggested, had been hitchhikers or girls he had murdered in the 70s after picking them up at bus stops. Fred claimed these 6 victims had been killed when they had threatened to inform Rose of his cheating, and that he had transported their bodies to Cromwell Street to abuse, dismember, and then bury in shallow graves. Between the 5th and 8th of March, police found a further 6 bodies of young females at 25 Cromwell Street. He shifted all blame for any of the crimes to himself rather than the 2 of them. Each victim had been extensively mutilated, and each body bore evidence of having been subjected to extreme sexual abuse prior to the act of murder. Each set of remains was missing numerous bones, particularly phalanges. Fred refused to divulge the reason or whereabouts of the bones missing from each set of remains. Suspicions rose against Mrs. West following her husband's revelations. Rose was arrested on 20th of April 1994. initially on offences relating to the rape of an 11-year-old girl and the physical assault of an 8-year-old boy, both charges dating from the mid-1970s. The following day, she was refused bail and transferred to Pucklechurch Prison to be held in the maximum security wing. Here, she was questioned more closely about the murders, in particular those of her daughter Heather and Linda Goth, and on the 25th of April, she was formally charged with Goth's murder. By the 6th of May, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with 5 counts of murder, with Rose simply replying, "I'm innocent," upon hearing each charge. As well as the murders of the victims exhumed from Cromwell Street, Fred had confessed to the murders of his first wife and stepdaughter, and to knowing the location of Anne McFall's remains. Although he always denied killing her, Fred agreed to identify each burial location, and their remains were unearthed between the 10th of April and the 7th of June. Fred and Rose West were brought before a magistrate's court in Gloucester on the 30th of June 1994. He was charged with 11 murders and she was charged with 9. This was the first time the couple had seen each other since Fred's February arrest. Prior to hearing the formal charges against them, Fred leaned toward his wife and gently placed his hand upon her shoulder, which she physically rejected. Both were ordered held on remand. As police attempted to lead Fred from the hearing, he resisted their efforts and again attempted to move towards Rose, who again winced and attempted to writhe away from his grasp. Immediately after this court appearance, Fred was rearrested on suspicion of murdering Anne McFall and was formally charged with Anne McFall's murder on the 3rd of July, appearing in court the following morning. Fred had become increasingly depressed in his time in prison, and Rose's public rejection of him at Gloucester Magistrates Court on the 30th of June did not help. Her refusal to reply to letters he sent her, and reports leaked to the press in which she had assumed the role of grieving mother who had lost a daughter and stepdaughter to her husband, and in which she declared both her innocence of murder and her hatred of him, had all made Mr. West not only angry, but resentful of his wife. In response to being ignored, Fred withdrew his earlier confessions to having acted alone in the murders, and instead accused his wife of almost total culpability in all the murders to which he had been charged, excluding that of Anne McFall, which he claimed had been committed by his first wife. The duo had now turned against each other in a bid to not only hurt one another, but shift all blame. Not prepared to deal with the consequences of their crimes, Rose refusing to go down together and Fred insisting he not go alone. Unfortunately, he never paid his dues in prison. Following his conviction on the 1st of January 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell by using an improvised rope he had constructed from a blanket and tags he had stolen from prison laundry bags around his neck. At the bottom of the suicide note found in his cell was a drawing of a gravestone, within which was written, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace. Where no shadow falls, in perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." Rose was tried alone. At pre-trial proceedings in February, Rose pleaded not guilty to 10 charges of murder, the murder of Charmaine West having been added to the original 9 after Fred's suicide. Prosecution witnesses included Cromwell Street lodgers, victims, relatives, Rose's mother, and surviving victims including stepdaughter Anna Marie West, Catherine Holliday, a former lover of Mr. West, and Carolyn Owens, and a Miss A who had been sexually assaulted at 14 by Fred and Rose West in 1977, whose identity is hidden, and who described Rose as a more aggressive perpetrator of the two, damning her as a sexual deviant though she pled otherwise. The final witness to testify at Rose's trial was Fred's appointed appropriate adult, Janet Leach, whom the prosecution had called to testify in rebuttal to the tape recordings of Fred's confessions in which he had stressed Rose had known nothing at all about any of the murders. Leach testified that Fred had confided in her that on the evening prior to his 25th February arrest, he and Rose had formed a pact whereby he would take full responsibility for all the murders, many of which he had privately described to her as being some of Rose's mistakes. He had further divulged that Rose had indeed murdered Charmaine while he had been incarcerated, and had also murdered Shirley Robinson. Following 7 weeks of trial, the judge sentenced Rosemary to life in prison, emphasizing that she should never be paroled, and to this day she professes her innocence in the case, though her surviving victims make a convincing case otherwise. While the case seemed to be over for many years, In the past month, suspicions as to the disappearance of 15-year-old Mary Bastholm has been theorised to be another possible victim of the West, particularly as she was a waitress at a cafe Fred frequented. But to date, no body has been found, while the young girl's boyfriend at the time suggests Mr. West was not responsible. Mr. West's son, Stephen, has said that he firmly believes the missing teenager was an early victim of his father, as Fred had openly boasted of having committed Bastholm's murder whilst on remand. Police were unable to charge Fred with his crime as they had no evidence. Police have begun to excavate the grounds of a cafe in Gloucester after receiving information that the body of Mary Bastholm may be buried there. Mr. West is known to have conducted repair work on the drains of this cafe in late 1967, making it a possible dumping ground for more of the young women he targeted. However, the likelihood of Mr. West moving from the comfort of their home to a dump site seems very unlikely, as they never divert over the years of their wrongdoing, though only time can tell what could be uncovered there. An unfortunate update to the story is that after searching multiple suspicious voids at the cafe, they found no bodies, which is both a relief and also a sad story because we still don't know where Mary is. The crimes committed by Fred and Rose West will never be forgotten about in the UK, and we are still discovering the crimes they committed together to this day. We'll keep you updated as this story develops if there are any new updates. Thank you for joining us, and if you enjoyed this extra long story, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this content. Thank you again for joining us, and as always, stay safe.